as we had just finished talking about, Paul Revere had made his famous bride. So everyone knew that the British were coming. And they were headed to Concord, a small town that we had just talked about that had supplies, gunpowder. But if you look at your map, the British have to go through Lexington in order to get there. So at dawn, the Redcoats did. They appeared in Lexington. They'd marched all night. And when they arrived, they meet about 70 Minutemen in the center of town. A shot was fired. Nobody really knows by which side. And then both sides let loose. Due to the technology, the gunpowder, and the smoke that filled the air, there was relatively few casualties compared to what it could have been. There was only 8 Minutemen that were killed, and we don't have a number of the British. So it really wasn't that major of a battle, seeing how it could have been explosive and killed everybody using today's technology. Well, the British saw that as a small step, and they continued their march onto Concord. Unfortunately for the Redcoats, when they got to Concord, they realized that the Massachusetts militia had already been there. The gunpowder and other supplies had already been removed. So they began a march back to Boston. As they were marching back, the militia started firing on them. The militia, the Minutemen, had hidden themselves in the landscape along the road. And as the British marched down the road, they became basically sitting ducks. The American, in particular, the Massachusetts militia, started firing. When the Redcoats got to Boston, they had nowhere else to go. They had to continue down this road. There were over 200 of them were wounded, and 73 were killed. It was a pretty remarkable feat, and the Americans had surprised the British with something that they had never thought that they would have to face. This is not how fighting took place back in Europe at the time. So the British never expected this to happen. Following Lexington and Concord, more military action took place. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys captured the British fort of Ticonderoga. Calls went throughout the colonies for volunteers to join the militia. And in and around Boston, 20,000 men joined. Now, the next major battle that we need to talk about is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is one of the essential battles to showing the British what the Americans were about. On June 16th, 1775, about 1,200 militiamen set up at Bunker Hill. Now, it is a hill. They could look and see what the British were doing. But the British decided they wanted to take that position from the Americans. They didn't like the Americans were overlooking Boston and could see when they were moving troops out. Now, being on top of a hill is not the best strategic location to fight a battle. And so pretty soon the American forces ran low on ammunition. At this point, American Colonel Prescott reportedly shouted to his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." He wanted them to make certain that when you shot, you could actually kill the enemy. Well, as it turned out, the Americans still ran out of gunpowder and they had to leave. But what it really showed the British is that the Americans would not be easily defeated. If the British wanted to maintain control in America, they were going to have to beat the Americans. The Americans were not simply going to lay down and let the British win. Key moment. While there is fighting going on, there is additional conflict within the colonies. Americans had to choose sides. Now this should be simple, But there remained a group of people called loyalists, people who were loyal to Britain, that felt as though the rebels were not justified. There was no real reason to break away from Britain. They didn't find unfair taxes. And notice that I use the word unfair taxes. They probably would have just said they did not figure taxes and regulations to be a good enough reason to rebel. Now, the Patriots are those who were determined to fight the British. They needed independence, and they needed it very badly. They were called rebels. So it was a difficult decision to move towards independence, choosing sides. So we are at moving towards independence. The first shots have been fired. The key term for this section is the Olive Branch Petition. Now, declaring independence was still a ways off, but we had the Second Continental Congress was organizing and assembled for the first time in Philadelphia. All 13 colonies sent delegates. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures. Hopefully some of these pictures look familiar. These were some of those guys that were at the first Continental Congress. But then we add some other delegates that hadn't been there to begin with. For instance, John Hancock. He would go on to be the first person to sign the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Franklin, pretty well known. He was vital in creating the Constitution in a few years. And Thomas Jefferson. All of these men played a key role in that Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress begins to actually govern the colonies. First of all, they authorized the printing of colonial money. Continental money, actually, not colonial, because they're wanting to break away. They also established a post office that would reach all of the colonies. They wanted to keep everybody in the loop, keep up communication, what's happening in Massachusetts, the people in Virginia need to know that. So they established the first post office. They also established a committee and groups of a collection of committees to communicate with Native Americans and other countries. They needed to be seen as ambassadors, being their own independent country. So they created these committees. And finally, they created the Continental Army to fight against the British. This was a pretty big deciding we're on our when they make that decision. Now, trivia question, I would like you to write this in your notes. A new Continental Army needed a new commander. So, for some extra credit points, write down who they selected. This is the end of section 2.5, and we'll continue the war in the next few presentations.